everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of From the Yarra River to the Mediterranean Sea. My name is Hannah, and I am joining you in your ears from Melbourne, also known as Naarm in Australia. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am recording this podcast on unceded Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. So this episode is a little bit different than usual. It's an interview between Ittay and Ahmed Fouad Al-khatib, who is a US citizen from Gaza and a Middle East political analyst. Ahmed has a master's degree in intelligence studies from American Military University and has written and contributed extensively to publications on Gaza's affairs in the US and also Israeli, Jewish and Arab outlets. In this episode, Ahmed speaks to Ittay about his childhood experience in the UNWRA schools of Gaza. UNWRA being the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, which is a UN agency that supports the relief and human development of Palestinian refugees. Ahmed also talks about the many events that have occurred throughout his life that led him to see the world as he does today. In this episode, Ittay and Ahmed also touch on the many challenges that Jewish-Palestinian dialogue groups face at this time and some suggestions to build bridges moving forward. At a time when it's so rare to see people from Gaza and Israel actually talking to one another, this episode reaffirms our belief that talking to each other, listening to each other, and understanding each other is always preferable than cancelling each other. So that's it from me, and we really hope that you enjoy this episode.
So welcome to From the Yarra to the Mediterranean Sea. We are really pleased to have Ahmed Fouad Al-khatib joining us today. Sabah al-khair.
Sabah al-noor. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. I first came across you from your extensive social media presence. I've read your articles on Washington Post, Atlantic, and also in many Jewish publications as well. And I think our listeners will hopefully have a lot to learn from your insights and your life experience. And I guess I wanted to begin this conversation by asking you about your childhood in Gaza. What was it like growing up there?
Well, thanks again for reaching out. I appreciate it. And yeah, so I had a slightly, my life is very unusual on every conceivable level. Part of that is that I was born and lived a small part of my childhood in Saudi Arabia, but every year our family was going back and forth to the Gaza Strip, as is common with a lot of Palestinians. My dad was working in Saudi Arabia as a physician, and so our family would go back and forth to visit at least twice a year, but we also actually lived in Gaza a couple of years in the mid-90s and then moved back to Saudi and then finally moved back in the year 2000 before the second intifada began. And I actually, Gaza had a short-lived airport between 98 to 2000, and I flew into it a couple of times on the Palestinian Airlines. So that was I always reference that as an aviation geek. I just remember that as the most favorable part of my childhood there. And even while I was there, I mean, multiple things are true. There was definitely violence. There were degradations in the quality of life, but there were also beautiful times and moments where people managed to make the best out of the circumstances and managed to have a good time and eat good kanafa and eat good food and get together and do kind of, and I've been to a lot of weddings, if you will, and parties and events in Gaza so my memory of Gaza is not just of war and my own personal suffering and that of my family and my friends, but it's of people that love life and wanted an opportunity to grow and get married and have kids and have homes. I attended UNWRA schools, which, as you know, 2/3 of Gazans are considered refugees or descendants of refugees. And so that means you have to attend UNWRA schools. The 1/3 that remain are considered native, if you will, which means they're actually from Gaza. And those tend to attend only either some private schools or mainly local government schools. And so UNWRA schools were very crowded, and we had a serious problem with lice, and we had a lot of issues there. But I also have actually fond memory, and it was super crowded. We had like 50 students per class.
Wow, 50.
For like a class that was designed for like 20 or 25. And that apparently got worse. And to accommodate the large number of students, they do multiple periods. When I was there, they did a morning period or an afternoon period. And I always despised the afternoon period. I always wanted to just get school over with so that I can have the rest of the day. Apparently now, my nieces and nephews tell me that, this was before October 7th, the crowding is so bad right now that they do 3 periods. They do like morning from like 7 to like 11:30. They do the mid-afternoon, and then they do the late afternoon. So I was like, oh my goodness, I'm glad I escaped that. But yeah, and when I left Gaza, the population was around 1.4 million, and now it's at around 2.3 million. So it almost increased by another million, or almost doubled really. And so like I said, it also in addition to the beautiful times, there were a lot of horrendous times. I, for example, in 2001, experienced an up-close bombardment by the Israeli Air Force. We were just walking home from school, but I was always a fast walker, and they were slow, so I sped up, and 2 minutes later, we were passing by a police station that was destroyed by an airstrike. And so I then returned, knowing that they were there. I returned looking to look for them, and then a second strike took place, and I was very close I was like right next to the building, and so the concussive wave, call it the blast wave, if you will, had a kind of hit me on one side, and I'm largely deaf in my left ear. It's asymmetric hearing loss, and that causes me horrendous ringing and eustachian tube issues and other challenges that I face daily. But it pales in comparison to what numerous people in Gaza have experienced while I was there, but certainly since.
So I want to ask. Sorry, you live in the US now, in San Francisco, is that correct?
Yes, I'm 33 years old. I left Gaza when I was 15 in 2000, and in 2005. Sorry, apologies. Right before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements, and I've not been back to Gaza since. I got asylum in the United States, and I can certainly share more about how I came to the U.S., but my immediate and extended family, most of them are still in Gaza.
So I want to skip now to October 7th. Where were you that day, and how did you first react when you heard what happened that day?
So I had just walked home here. It was Friday night, October 6th, and I went on a really long, 7-mile late night walk. And when I came back and I saw my phone started blowing up with notifications saying something weird is going on, something nobody knew for the first half hour, 45 minutes, what exactly was happening. And as soon as I saw it, I'll never forget it, man. I was so horrified, so sick to my stomach for a variety of reasons. Initially, there were just the scenes that we saw were of the borders being breached, of, the first lines of contact, if you will, being overwhelmed by an attack. There wasn't an understanding of the true extent of the attack and the horrors that took place, and the attacks on civilians and the kibbutzim all around the Gaza envelope. But I immediately knew that Gaza as we knew it was going to cease to exist. And I had been keeping up with Gaza. To me, this is not just an intellectual or an analytical issue. This is one that is deeply personal. I knew immediately that this was going to elicit a disastrous response from the Israeli military. I was horrified by the initial kind of euphoria that a lot of supposed activists and pro-Palestine folks had about the attack, thinking that this is somehow, the people breaking out of the prison and just like people, fighting back and as if this was an expression of resistance. But I also, at the same time, remember vividly going immediately to social media where I follow numerous Palestinian accounts, particularly those in Gaza, in parallel with the scenes that get played over and over of the Gazans that were cheering on the attack and celebrating it. I came across a few hundred posts that were warning of the consequences, were warning and of what was going to take place, but also specifically calling out Hamas and saying that this attack is basically Hamas running away from its governance failures, from its political failures and impotence, and doing the only thing that they know how to do best, which is violence and militarism and militancy and terrorism. And so, unfortunately, a lot of those voices got drowned out by the especially in the Western diaspora and whether it be, I've seen that in Arab audiences in the Middle East, but certainly in the Western audiences, and we saw the proliferation of the red triangles and all the scenery, the parachutes of celebrating the paragliders that slaughtered hundreds of people at the Nova Music Festival. And so, like, what I will also say is, I think there was a spectacular nature, not spectacular in a complimentary way, but like spectacular in like, OMG, like we've never seen the combined arms approach that Hamas used for the attack, certainly due to years of training and financing by Hezbollah and Iran and others, but we've never seen the combined use of these paragliders and sappers blowing holes throughout the border, and naval commandos being sent into Israel, and then motorized units and trucks and motorcycles and massive barrage of bombardment and the use of little drones and the use of snipers. I mean, it was so well planned and well executed that I think to some people they just enjoyed the idea that a besieged group could somehow pull this off, which what I have tried to tell people is at what cost, not just at what cost of what followed, but at what cost, of almost 2 decades under blockade that is the direct result of Hamas's choices and Hamas's desires to turn Gaza into a resistant citadel. So that's... So look,
I'll say, look, I experienced October 7th in Jerusalem with, rockets being fired on my house very early in the morning, and then, like the rest of the country, going onto my phone, seeing initially, the white Toyotas driving around the streets of Sderot and other streets in the south, and just, I guess in shock at how, this so-called impenetrable wall had been broken down. And then, obviously, since then, my life has been, turned upside down, like I think many Israelis have. And I think what I found so interesting about what you said about October 7th is you didn't just sort of explain why, Hamas may have thought what they were doing was, somehow, benefiting the resistance, but you also condemned it and expressed sympathy with Israelis and with Jews all over the world who have been suffering it at this point. And I wanted to ask, I guess, how did you come to have these views? Have you done dialogue groups with Jews before? And what have you done, I guess, in your life to prepare you for, I guess, the role you've taken as a peace advocate since October 7th.
So my journey in the United States began the success of my journey was partly enabled by a dialogue group that actually found a host family, a host mother, if you will, for me, who would later on kind of take me in as almost a son and help me get on my feet until I was able to get asylum and go to school, finish high school, etc. So there's a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group / room in the Bay Area, led by Len and Libby Traubmans, who had been doing this for years and years. Amazing people. They basically, my host mother learned about me needing a home in the community and in the city where I lived at the time as a high school student, as an exchange student with the State Department. To me, the idea of engaging with Jews and Israelis was always intriguing, even when I was in Gaza. I mean, I was always much older than my true age. I was always an old soul in a young body, and I was really interested in history and really interested in going beyond just, I never played with the kids. I always sat with the adults and listened, because I was really fascinated by world events and the history. But I also remember the 90s and the 2000s when Yasser Arafat, for all of his flaws, was pushing for, some kind of a peace and some kind of a, renunciation of violence. And I remember Hamas trying to undermine that. And I remember other groups trying to say that any engagement with the Israelis was a form of treason and cowardly, it was treacherous, etc. And so I always suspected that there was even as a child, there was a lot more to the story than just, we just have to separate ourselves from the Israelis and not engage them and any kind of talk. Because also another thing that is propagated often, that any time you engage Israel, and this was partly by Hamas, partly just by, I would say, ignorance and isolation, anytime you engage Israelis, it makes you susceptible to being recruited as a spy or as an asset, which certainly the Israeli, Shin Bet and military intelligence, Amman, have assets, and they use collaborators and Palestinians to point target and, human intelligence or humans. But that is so overstated that it almost criminalizes any engagement with the Israelis, and it makes it seem as if any engagement with the Israelis also normalizes all of the injustice, and it means you agree with all the. It's an unfortunate relic from, I would say, a lot of the anti-normalization trend. It's a relic from, I would say, the 50s and 60s, the pan-Arabism of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and after the defeat in '67, and how a lot of these entrenched narratives have kind of grown and taken a life of their own. So that was a long-winded way of saying I always doubted that engagement with the Israelis or Jews was inherently problematic and bad, particularly because the joke in the 90s, and my uncle was a day laborer in Israel, the joke in the 90s was that Gazans occupied Israel, because of how many day laborers, and they weren't just like random construction workers, they were in factories and offices. I mean, they were like heavily involved throughout all sectors of Israel's economy. And they built so many incredible connections with Israelis and people throughout mainland Israel. And so when I came to the United States, I was determined, and I'm going to be honest, I was also liberated from a lot of the limits of being in Gaza, and I'm talking physically, spatially. I didn't have my family, I didn't have my community. I was living with a white family, So I was determined to really push the boundaries and push myself out of my comfort zone and really attempt to connect with Jews. And like I said, it kind of landed in my lap that my literal stability in the United States was enabled by a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group. Furthermore, when I went into and it wasn't about let's hold hands and all sing Kumbaya and everything's going to be fine. It was very much so trying to establish the slightest of common ground, trying to have uncomfortable conversations while holding multiple truths, trying to allow ourselves to push each other without delegitimizing each other, without attacking each other. We could, and to normalize the concept that we could still be friends across our differences. We could still, that famous saying, like, you make peace with your enemies, not your friends.
I want to ask, just since October 7th, I know of in Australia many interfaith dialogue groups, the Jewish Christian Muslim Association and many others, that have essentially ceased operations because they've said, basically the Palestinians or the Muslims in the group have said, we're not going to come into this group if the Jews don't unequivocally condemn the bombing of Gaza. And the Jews have said, we're not going to come to this group if the Muslims don't unequivocally condemn every aspect of October 7th. And that red line has been put up by both groups, perhaps understandably so. And therefore, people that are not willing to say those two things unequivocally sort of can't come, which is pretty much everyone who is in those groups. I don't know if I know in Jerusalem I still have been going to Israeli-Palestinian dialogue groups, but what do you say to those groups that have broken down because of those, I guess, two understandable prerequisites for dialogue at this time?
Well, I mean, I challenge that they're prerequisites. I mean, why not say those things, like those conditions, unfortunately, further entrench the narratives. They further the isolation of both peoples, and then it becomes a matter of talking into the echo chamber. So then all the pro-Palestine and Muslim or Arab folks are going to talk to each other, and then all the Israelis and Jews are just going to talk to each other. To what end? Like, how is that going to move anything forward, even just from a communications and an effectiveness point of view? Like, that doesn't even help propagate and push your narrative forward. Like classic, don't talk to the choir, don't sing to the choir. So unfortunately, that's where I try to come in and operate in this no man's land where, I mean, like...
So how do you then talk as a Gazan? You've got family in Gaza and you've got relatives there. How do you talk to Israelis or Zionist Jews who support the war in Gaza and who feel like it's necessary for Israel's self-defense? How do you begin a dialogue with someone who thinks that is necessary?
I mean, going back to the multiple truths, like, I can tell you right now that a lot of Gazans don't want Hamas to stay in power. A lot of Gazans don't want the continuation of this unfortunate, they feel that they're being held hostage by a group that doesn't really care about them. And even though I'm opposed to the massive, indiscriminate, at times seemingly indiscriminate use of force and bombardment, like, it's like, what did Hamas expect? Like, any country in the world that would get attacked in the way that Israel would respond. Like, and I'm not even sitting here justifying Israel's response. I'm simply saying that, like, yes, like, every action has a reaction. And do I think Israel's action is proportionate? No. Do I think Israel has committed war crimes? Absolutely. Look at my family and the death of over 30 of them, including a bombing that killed 25 all at once. Babies as young as 3 and 4 months old, shredded and cut up to pieces. Like headless bodies of all my aunts and uncles on my mom's side that were in Rafah. So I absolutely don't agree with the military operation in Gaza. I also believe that Hamas must be prevented from ever ruling the Strip, and how that is achieved is certainly subject up for debate.
Fine. I wanted to ask, just following on what you said though, why do you think it's easier as Palestinians, or there's more Palestinians protesting Hamas in Gaza than there is in the streets of London or New York or California? Why is it that, in some ways, I think both the Jewish and Zionist diaspora and the Palestinian diaspora often have, in a way, a much harder line and a much more uncompromising in supporting their, unequivocal narratives than people who actually live here that do meet and that do dialogue, and, like myself is a perfect example of that. why do you think it's so hard for the pro-Palestine, the Zionist groups in the US, in Australia, and other places to have these kinds of conversations like we're having now?
So I mean, I think that connects back to just the earlier question that you were asking. So it is precisely the suffering of my family, the death of my family members, the horrors that are taking place, that are fueling my desire for a different future and a different path forward, the same as many Palestinians in Gaza. So and part of that path is gonna entail talking to Jews and talking to Palestinians, talking to activists, talking to whoever, to relay the extent of the suffering and the horror that's taking place. I want the Zionists and the Jews and the Israelis to know what's happening in Gaza. I have, through and people tell me this all the time, through my demeanor, through my activism, through my writing, through my posture, if you will, I've helped humanize Gazans in ways that 1,000 protests may not have been able to. I've reached otherwise unreachable audiences because of the entrenchment and the cessation of dialogue and conversations. A lot of Israelis and a lot of Jews don't know the extent of the suffering. Either they think it's fake and made up on social media, or I have friends in Israel that tell me a lot of the mainstream media, there is a sanitized version of the war that's being presented that doesn't really show much of the suffering in Gaza. So it is advantageous. That's what I tell the pro-Palestine folks. It is advantageous to keep the dialogue going, simply, again, from a communications efficacy point of view. To get your messages out there without yelling and the screaming and without the violence and without just the verbal violence. And, as for your question, I mean, that is the thesis of my whole kind of grief with a lot of the pro-Palestine folks or the diaspora folks who mean well. Their hearts are often, or generally speaking, in the right place, and they are horrified by what's happening, but the stakes are way higher when you're actually experiencing the horrors in Gaza and when you actually have to live under Hamas. Again, living under Hamas is such a horrendous, awful reality for so many Gazans that have known nothing but blockade, 8 hours of electricity a day, polluted water, 40 to 70% unemployment, inability to get in and out of Gaza. And that isn't just because Israel is inherently, out there to just besiege Gaza and just want to kill them all. That is the result of actions and strategies and priorities and policies by Hamas. Anytime, like you can't say I'm going to govern Gaza and then be like, I'm also going to turn Gaza into a resistance citadel, and I'm going to do another October 7th, and I'm going to keep launching rockets, and I'm going to keep doing smuggling operations to get weapons. Like that's going to have a consequence, and the consequence is a blockade. It's repeated wars. And unfortunately, Hamas has found ways to insulate itself from the impact of the blockade, from the impact of the wars. They have their tunnels, they're underground, while they left their people fending above ground. So that's why war is never going to help us. Armed resistance is absolutely detrimental. It's futile. It is destructive. It has failed for years and years, whether it be when it was done by the Arab countries, whether it was when it was done by the nationalist Palestinian movement, or whether now being done by the Islamist groups. It has failed us for 75 years. We need to try something different. And that's why you look at these polls, which I dispute. I think they're hogwash. But even within for a variety of reasons, that show overwhelming support for Hamas. But even if you want to work with these polls, which again, I fundamentally dispute, and we can get into that later, it shows a far greater support for Hamas in the West Bank than it is in Gaza, because they don't have to live with the consequences of Hamas's actions. Same as a lot of these diaspora folks who want to be entrenched and think that the Intifada is this sexy, beautiful, revolutionary act, when in fact the Intifada has entailed, I'm in my left ear because of the Intifada. They get killed in the Intifada. The Intifada worse than the occupation in the West Bank. The Intifada entailed a lot of suicide bombings that killed hundreds of innocent Israeli people for no achievable outcome or gain whatsoever. So that's what, and I'll be honest with you, man. I used to get frustrated sometimes with dialogue in the past, because for me, as an action-oriented, pragmatist, realist, I want actions. I don't want to just keep talking about this forever, right? I want an outcome that improves people's lives, that effectuates change. And I used to get frustrated after years of being in Jewish-Israeli or Jewish-Palestinian dialogue. I was like, all right, I want to go to the next level. But the discourse has devolved so much where I yearn for just the basic taste of dialogue. We need to just go back to the basics, because we are so, this is so troubling what has happened. And it has happened over the years, but unfortunately, October 7th accelerated the demise of basic human-to-human connections, to be able to hold multiple truths, to talk about different realities, and to do so even while you disagree, to do so in respectful manners. And what disgusts me, unfortunately, is that, okay, fine, there might be some people that are maybe less aware, less informed, less this, they might lash out or act out. The Israelis and the Palestinians are neither side is going anywhere. So we need to actually have a grassroots base for coexistence that can actually support and back up the needed political changes.
Right. Yeah, and that last point you said, really, that's really a strong message of groups such as Standing Together. In all of their messaging, they constantly highlight, that there's 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians that live between the river and the sea, and neither of us is going anywhere, and we have to find a way to share this country.
Well, I'm really curious as to, because I have been doing a lot of conversations and podcasts and engagements with a lot of Israelis and across the spectrum. And so when a friend of mine, I let's just not mention his name, but I went on his podcast recently, and he was sharing with me how a lot of his family members were kind of challenging him for talking to me and engaging with me and saying, well, and there's tears of it, maybe he's not really anti-Hamas, maybe he's just that's a whole con, there's a lack of trust, excuse me, or maybe he's anti-Hamas, but ultimately he's anti-Israel. But so from the Israeli side, what kind of pushback do you get on trying to promote dialogue and trying to, maybe I understand on the Palestinian side, there's there's war, they're killing us, there's this injustice, historic and contemporary. What pushback is there on the Israeli side against, or the Jewish side?
Yeah, I'll start off with the media in Israel that I watch every night. So, Khan and 12, 14, the sort of mainstream stations. When you turn on the 8 o'clock bulletin, you get, an hour of news, of which about 20 minutes is what happened in Gaza that day and how we're winning and how we killed all these Hamas targets. Then there's 20 minutes of political analysis, what's going to happen with the hostages, America, the latest Qatar negotiations, that sort of thing. And then the last 20 minutes is October 7th story. Still now, 5 months on, it's a hostage story, it's a widowed family, it's maybe another new video has emerged from October 7th, it's inside Kibbutz Be'eri or Kfar Aza, and I think for a lot of Israelis, it's still October 7th, and we're still in mourning, whereas I know for a lot of Palestinians, you're mourning, people like Sidra Husama, the 7-year-old girl who was killed in Rafah, and so many of these sort of iconic deaths of children that I think every Palestinian knows their names, that it just don't reach our media at all. And I think for a lot of Israelis, when I tell them what I do, they say, what you do is wonderful, but A, you're very naive, and B, I'm not ready for that because I'm still in my own grief from October 7th. So I can't talk to a Palestinian about their grief because I'm still mourning my losses from that day, and also the losses that have died since then, mainly Israeli soldiers or people killed in rocket attacks. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think for a lot of Israelis, it's very, very hard to, when you feel under attack, to want to talk to the so-called enemy because it feels like disloyal, or maybe, and you have to sort of open your heart a lot. I guess for me, before this war, I had 6 years preparation, because I've been in a dialogue group facilitating and also doing dialogue myself with them. And also I think my approach to Judaism as well, there's a saying in Perikei Avot, which is like the Jewish ethics of the fathers, and it says, Ezehu chacham alomed mikol adam. So who is wise? One who learns from every person. And I'm really of the belief that the people I learn most from are the people I disagree with, because it's so easy for me to talk to people I agree with. But when I talk to people that I disagree with, who challenge me, and I live in Jerusalem, and thankfully everyone in this city disagrees with me because there's not many liberals in this city. So I speak to Haredim, I speak to Palestinians, I speak to religious Zionists, I speak to very right-wing people, very people to the left of me as well. And all of those conversations challenge my worldview, because I think in order to make sort of ethical decisions in this life, you have to talk to people that disagree with you. And I think you have that skill and that ability, which is sort of why I wanted to talk to you. But I feel like that is something so hard to find between the river and the sea right now. And maybe it's not by accident that we're having this conversation in English rather than in Hebrew or Arabic. But it's something I wish there was more of.
Well, no, and I certainly appreciate that. And I mean, one of the things that I increasingly see more and more, and this triggers so many pro-Palestine folks when I attempt to even articulate it, like, don't get me wrong, the power dynamics are unequal. There's like, in one sense, there is no two sides. You have like, I mean, there are two sides, like just factually, but like you have a nuclear armed state that is essentially an economic and a military superpower with immense global backing and an immensely diverse population, and just Israel is a really powerful state, right? Versus a group of people that have been displaced for a long time, and through their own political failures and their leaders' horrible decisions and through Israeli actions, they're in this situation right now. So, like, I genuinely believe that. That said, in terms of just understanding certain dynamics and how people view the other side, how people propagate certain points of view, I genuinely believe there's absolutely a two-sidism, if you will. Like, me talking to Israelis right now is viewed as treacherous and betraying the Palestinian victims, whatever. An Israeli talking to me right now is viewed similarly. Pro-Palestine folks will show pictures of Israeli children being shown guns and signing shells being sent to Gaza, whatever. Yeah. The pro-Israel folks will show pictures of Gaza's children being indoctrinated and holding guns and holding this and that. Like, and take this approach, like, for example, the denial of the sexual abuse and assault that took place on October 7th by the very people who were like, oh, well, like 2 days ago, there was a report by the UN that spoke of some instances of harassment or abuse or pressure or whatever. It's like, people that deny Israeli atrocities, but they're what happened to Israeli women, but they're like so quick to say, oh, well, but it happened to the Palestinian women, and vice versa. Folks who, it's like, I see this, like, now I really, in a way, this, like, in a way that I haven't before. I mean, well, I was aware of it before, but I can see both sides, like, engaging in very similar dynamics and trends and acts to attack the other, delegitimize the other, criminalize engagement with the other. And to me, the fact that I am the fact that I'm one of the few voices who are like so prominently calling for that, it doesn't make me, if anything, it actually makes it more important that I do this. It can be discouraging at times, but it actually makes me feel like, yes, I'm in the right place at the right time and doing exactly what needs to be done. But I will say, I mean, it's frustrating, man. there are, at a time when so many Gazans on the ground, and you see the protests against Hamas, and you see Hamas shooting at these protests, you see, like, if you're experiencing the misery of the war and Hamas is not negotiating an end of the war and the release of the hostages and political transformation, you're not sitting there saying, gee, like, I think October 7th was so solid, or gee, like, the resistance is so great. Like, droves and droves of Gazans are turning on Hamas and instead of amplifying that message and saying the Palestinian cause is about much more than Hamas, the Palestinian issue is much bigger, Hamas is but a small element, or should be turned into this irrelevant small element, people are refusing to do that. And people in pro-Palestine folks, I can tell you right now, I know personally, some of them were, when I was promoting these protests against Hamas, they were saying that, oh, well, these must be, paid by Israeli agents or spies or whatever. It's like, I'm sorry, you're in London or you're in San Francisco and you're going to try to out Palestinian actual Gazans who are saying we've had enough of this, we want a different future. So I'm saying this, I guess that's a different way of saying, not only is it frustrating that there are tiers to why this dialogue isn't happening, but I do very much so believe that some on the pro-Palestine side are so incredibly harmful and detrimental to the very cause that they allege to support, and that they worsen this trend of entrenchment and putting up walls. And that I find much more harmful and distressing than even just folks in Gaza having a hard time connecting with Israelis or talking to Israelis.
I want to ask about peace. Peace is the hardest word to talk about. I know for a lot of Israelis, they will say after October 7th, there'll never be peace with Palestinians because they've showed their true colours of what they want to do to us. And sadly, many Israelis see Hamas as representing the Palestinian cause in its entirety, based on those polls that you spoke about. That played a big part of it, but also the election of Hamas and those sorts of things. And I think a lot of Israelis fear that if Israel does end the occupation and Israel does create a two-state solution or a confederation, that will then be used as a launch pad for further October 7th style attacks. What do you say to Israelis that have a fear of giving Palestinians the freedom that I believe personally that you deserve? But how do you tell Israelis that you don't need to fear that, or are Israelis right to fear that any sort of peace settlement could further harm Israeli security?
I mean, people like Hamas did a good job of making those fears real for a lot of Israelis, not just from, I mean, when Israel pulled out of Gaza, and yes, Israel maintained some aspects of its control of Gaza, and it was not an entire disengagement. But I understand your fears. I really do. And I mean that genuinely. I am incredibly disappointed by the Gaza experiment and by what took place there. However, unfortunately, perpetuating the occupation is almost going to guarantee that more people will turn to violence, and more people will like military solutions and walls alone will not work, as we've seen from Gaza, as we've seen in the West Bank. I genuinely believe that should there be a sincere phased implementation of the end of the occupation, starting with pause any settlement expansion, rein in settlers and their violence, allow Palestinians in the West Bank, farmers, and just allow them access to their orchards, stop seizing lands, stop seizing water wells, like basic steps just to stabilize the status quo as the first phase will immediately have a beneficial impact to de-escalate the tensions and create a fertile soil, if you will, for people being like, okay, let's actually negotiate. Let's actually push for a different future. I think that the perpetuation of the occupation guarantees the risk of, they might not be October 7th, but dozens of micro October 7th. God forbid. I don't want that. But that's what I fear, unfortunately, because it's very easy for nefarious players to prey on Palestinian resentment, which is a legitimate resentment from decades and decades of displacement. And again, we can talk about the Palestinian political failures. We can talk about the Israeli role in this. But the end result is you have a resentful, battered population that is very easy to incite and to turn towards violence. Unfortunately, this is where I push for on the Palestinian side, is that, I say Hamas didn't help in having us disarm those fears. But I genuinely believe that, it's kind of like, okay, when 9/11 happened in the United States, there was the necessary kind of military response to try and limit the threat of immediate and short-term terrorism. But unfortunately, a lot of our, it's like we had Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden, we ended up with dozens of franchised Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups. These issues cannot be solved by a military solution alone. I will say, while my sentiments are, I speak for myself, I've never claimed to speak on behalf of anyone else, I promise you that my sentiments and my beliefs are held by numerous Palestinians in fragmented and disjointed ways, but like people who just want to live and don't want to have anything to do with armed resistance. People that genuinely believe their economic prospects lie with contact and connection with Israel. People that want to access treatment in Israeli hospitals, not the Palestinian Authority hospitals. There are numerous Palestinians who I think would absolutely accept peaceful coexistence and potentially, with time, work to isolate the radical elements, just in the same way that you have radical elements in Israel, and they're not representative of the entirety of Israeli society. The elections that took place, Hamas is there because of democratic process. Hamas won elections almost 20 years ago when half of Gaza's population didn't even exist. So they violently took control of the Strip, and they hide behind the resistance narrative. And I will point you to the West Bank, where, for all of their faults, the Palestinian Authority has largely prevented violence, large-scale violence from taking place. Even though we can talk about the so-called pay to slay, which I think is an overly inflated thing, but I think some of it should be reformed and addressed. But for example, just a point on this pay to slay thing. When somebody commits a violent act against the Israelis or the settlements, it is a matter of policy that the army comes and destroys, and they're killed. The person is killed. The person is dead already. The army comes and destroys the home of the family of the attacker. That is a matter of a policy, and it's shameful. It's collective punishment. So then the Palestinian Authority, by paying the families of the attacker, the assailant, that is their only way of attempting to even rebuild their lives. That is just one specific narrow example of that.
It's interesting, what you're saying, because in a way you're saying that, Israel has all of these policies to ensure its security that Israel argues are essential. Walls, checkpoints, home demolitions, raids in Jenin, in Tulkarm. Israel says all of these things are essential to their security. But what you're saying, which is really interesting, is the exact things that Israel is doing to bring security for us are the things that are causing the violence. Those elements that the army does that we feel are essential, you're saying that each one of those security measures is what causes a response, and that if we stop doing those security measures, then there wouldn't be all those responses to them. Have I understood you correctly?
Largely true, absolutely. And again, I'm not saying that Israel doesn't have a right to security and to stability. And I understand that any country, when faced with immediate threats, will address those very threats. But how far you go in preempting and preventing those threats? And I mean, okay, you want to build a wall along the West Bank, fine. But why does that wall then encroach on Palestinian land? Why does it isolate Palestinian people from accessing their farms and they need to go through horrible checkpoints every day and gates in the wall? Like, how is that in fact a matter of security? So I think, going back to your earlier point, the occupation is a big part of, like, I don't think anything justifies October 7th, period, end of story. I'm not even remotely suggesting that it was a justified response to the occupation. Nevertheless, when you do perpetual security, heavy-handed security approach to control a population and occupy them, there are going to be lots of either resentful people or nefarious players that seek to work off of that resentment and to incite for violence and hatred. And you're not going to have a population living under occupation saying, gee, like, I understand why Israel is doing this. Like the farmer that's being prevented from accessing his farmland because of the separation wall or because of checkpoints or because of violent settlers. That's not going to be somebody who's going to be all about peace and coexistence, or is going to be like, oh yeah, I understand why Israel needs to prevent me from having...
And I would also say, even to affirm your point, if you look inside Israel in places like Haifa and Akko and Yafa, where many Palestinians live, where they have full Israeli citizenship and they have, they speak Hebrew and they have all the rights that I do as a Jewish Israeli, there isn't violence, which to me is a great example of showing that when you have a situation where all people have full equality, then whilst it's not full equality, obviously there is discrimination against Arabs, but it's nowhere near the inequality, let's say, between a Jew in the south of Israel and a Jew in Sderot. So there is something about equality being, for me, something far more effective than walls and checkpoints in securing both Israeli and Palestinian lives. But I know a lot of people who don't see it that way.
Absolutely, and that's what's unfortunate. It's like I understand. Again, I understand the need and the desire for security. Without security, there's no life, there's no economic development. But that security cannot be perpetually obtained at the expense of the Palestinian people, even though there are instances and examples, and you look at somebody like Hamas. I mean, a horrible example of leadership and incitement and breaking us apart and worsening the separation. Nevertheless, there are numerous Palestinians that would absolutely work towards peace and embrace peace and coexistence if they experience the benefits and the fruits of peace and coexistence, which is the right to property, the right to life, the right to equal freedom of movement, the right to, equal access. And so that's unfortunately not going to change. And I worry that after October 7th, and this is part of, Hamas might be evil, but they're not stupid. They wanted, as part of their strategy, to not only solicit or elicit a massive Israeli response in Gaza that would kill so many civilians to try and delegitimize Israel and stop Israel from going all the way and destroying them, but they counted on the further inflammation of violence in the West Bank and of the settlers going and attacking the West Bank, of Smotrich and Ben Gvir expanding the settlement enterprise to permanently kind of erode the prospect of peace. But I genuinely, and not naively, but from a pragmatic point of view, Israel's long-term security, existence, and legitimacy worldwide depends on peace with the Palestinians, and not just, token peace that is used for talking points on the media, but real peace that actually gives the Palestinians a chance at self-determination and sovereignty.
So I think that's a beautiful spot to end this conversation, because like you, I truly believe that the security that can come from agreements is 100 times more effective than the security that can come from walls and checkpoints and house demolitions and all of those sorts of things. And I think our peace agreement with Egypt, that Egypt killed 2,600 people on the Yom Kippur War, and then 4 years later we've got a peace agreement that's lasted, for well over 40 years. And I hope that this, horrific violence that we've seen since October 7th is something that leads us towards an understanding that for both Israelis and Palestinians, again, the security of agreements is something that is unmatched. And I really appreciate your voice in calling for that. And I wanted to thank you for joining us today from the Yarra River to the Mediterranean Sea.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I hope we have this conversation again, and certainly in person soon, inshallah.
Shukran, you're welcome to, inshallah, we'll see you in Al-Quds in Jerusalem, and we'll have a knafe near the Damascus Gate, and one day we'll be friends in peace.
Inshallah, ya Rab. Shukran, Habibi. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Shukran. Ma salama. Thank you. Bye.